Hi, welcome. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Angela Nichols, and I'm the Assistant Director for the Center for Peace, Justice, and Human Rights here at Florida Atlantic University. Today, our panel will be discussing the current crisis in Ukraine. Palina, we'll start with you.
Sure. So my name is Palina Prysmakova. I'm an assistant professor of School of Public Administration, College of Arts here at FAU, but I also serve on the board of a lot of diaspora organizations here in South Florida, and also I'm the secretary of Rada of Belarusian Democratic Republic, which is a government in exile that's been functioning already for 100 years.
Thank you. My name is Robert Rabil, and I'm professor of political science at Florida Atlantic University.
That's it?
Yes.
My name is Noemi Marin. I'm a professor of political communication in Florida Atlantic University in the School of Communication and Multimedia Studies. And I'm from Romania originally, and I study the political discourse of communism and post-communism.
Thank you all so much for introducing yourselves. Noemi, I'd like to start with you first, and I'd like to give each of you 5 minutes just to sort of share your current opinion or overview of the situation that we're seeing evolve in Ukraine right now. And we'll start with you.
I have been studying political discourse in Eastern and Central Europe since 1989. And this crisis is not new in the sense of the Cold War rhetoric, the Cold War discourse, political discourse had been split for a long, long time, since the 60s. And I would have liked this to not be the truth now in 2020, but we are at not just a crisis of army, not just a crisis of weapons, not just a crisis of nationalist discourse, not just a crisis of cultural and political public enemy discourse, but we are also at a crisis of understanding the ways in which political leaders formulate the appeals, the public appeals for their nations. Putin is predictable in that sense. He hasn't changed his discourse in many, many years. I wrote a piece 10, 11 years ago about the citizen Putin, where he changed by law the discourse, similar to what Stalin had done, similar to what Ceausescu had done in Romania, similar to what Brezhnev has done. So the fact that we didn't pay attention to that, the West, I mean, is not new, but it's not incomprehensible that the Russian people do not believe what happens in the West, why the Ukrainians are saying what they're saying. So we are at a crisis of democracy that is way deeper than just the crisis of two countries. We are a crisis of democracy, of understanding deep down what is the difference between authoritarian and democratic roots of how do people believe in their nations. That's mine.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
A lot to follow up on.
Sorry.
All right, Palina?
Oh, thank you, Robert. I mean, being from Belarus, being the citizen of Belarus, I would like to bring to attention also that the whole situation, the crisis in Ukraine, it would not have been possible, and we cannot separate it with the crisis in Belarus. We have in that country a dictator who was elected in '94 and seized the power, took over with the military a year after, and have been there since then. And we've seen that from apathy of the general population, there were big protests in 2000s with hundreds of thousands of people on the streets where they could not take his sixth term already, which followed up with all sort of repressions. And if somebody would ask me, I would say the crisis in Ukraine would have happened faster and earlier, but the first thing was for Putin to guarantee that there is a peace in Belarus, quote unquote, that all sort of movements of anybody with a free will of thought, any sort of activity would be able to resist. And it took a little longer than Putin would anticipate. It took almost 2 years, and we're talking, as of today, for 40,000 people have been arrested. We have about 33 journalists in prisons. We're talking about 10 people at least dead and 5,000 politically motivated charges. So including 5,000 of torture reports, and the list can go on. But with all this fear, it was possible for Putin to roll on his tanks and other military ammunition in the territory of Belarus to actually access the western part of Ukraine, because otherwise the war has been there already since 2014, right? But it was always on the side where Russia had access, but it didn't have access before. So kind of, I would like to contribute to the discussion, the broader picture of the region.
Thank you so much.
All
Robert?
right. Well, listen, it's a tragedy, and I am very saddened and really brokenhearted when I see what the Ukrainian go through. I was born in Lebanon. I served at the chief of the emergency of the Red Cross in Lebanon during the height of the civil war. And I understand war and the dynamics of war. And there is something that happens that really gets me very upset, is that this tragedy has been in the making for quite some time. It hasn't been in the making now. It has been in the making since the 1990s. Let's not forget, with the Clinton, United States pursued the policy of First Russia policy. This First Russia policy ended in 1996. Then the United States saw that its security is better served in expanding NATO. Now, some people say, or some pundit or some scholar would say, listen, well, NATO is not defense, it's a defense alliance, it's not offense. It doesn't matter. It's a military alliance, period. And more so, as a matter of fact, you have George Kennan, he was the author of the containment of the Soviet Union, he spoke about it, you have other professors. But more so also, we had such a miscommunication with Russia and China. And it's not like little miscommunication, big miscommunication. I'll give you some examples. We have, in order to deal with them, we have to understand where they come from, their outlook. And their outlook really somehow clashes with our outlook. And let me give you some example. Serbia. When we went and we gave the okay to NATO to hit the Serbian on account of Kosovo in 1999, they did not have, the United Nations sanctions. Iraq, when we went into Iraq, we did not have the United Nations sanctions. And recently, as a matter of fact, some people don't speak about it, but it's extremely important. From the position of Putin as an autocrat and of Xi, as an autocrat as well. They saw that, Muammar al-Gaddafi gave everything to the West. He told us about where he got his nuclear, material and know-how. He paid for the Scotland, for the Lockerbie, billions of dollars. And then, what happened is that we spoke with the Chinese, we spoke with the Russians, and we told them, listen, don't veto that resolution. And that resolution in 2011 was about protecting the Libyan people from the aggression of Muammar al-Gaddafi. So what happened is that, this resolution was used to oust Muammar al-Gaddafi. And just listen to what Xi and Putin had to say. They said, listen, we were naive, we will never be naive again. So mainly from their outlook, you have two outlooks in the world. Yes, I know they are autocrats, I know they are brutal in their ways, but the ways they look at the world now, they feel that United States and the Western world has committed many blunders under the pretext of democracy. So from their perspective, they believe that we use democracy, according to our whims. Something I disagree with, but from their perspective, this is why we have to know, if you are going to deal with them, you have to know from where they come from. So yes, you might tell me Putin is a dictator, Putin is a brutal, and I know Putin myself. I went to Syria. I know what he saw in Syria. I studied about Chechnya. So listen, there's nothing crazy about him. There is something called objective and achieving this objective. And this is what's happening in Ukraine, as a matter of fact. It's going to take all the eastern Ukraine, and really, I say that he's not going to be able to win the war, but he's going to do whatever it takes not to lose the war.
Okay. So I think the first question I'd like to ask each of you after your brief summary, I think that sort of overlaps with each, is this idea that perhaps the Cold War never actually ended, and that maybe the West has been playing a game that Putin has not been playing. And I think you alluded to this, Robert, saying that Putin is a rational actor with goals, he's being strategic, his plans and rhetoric haven't changed. And so it's fair to say that his objectives, his behavior hasn't changed, but our perception of it seems to have. So I'm wondering, is this in fact us waking up to the idea that the Cold War never actually really ended, or is it something different? Is that a little bit too drastic to ask? Noemi?
I was just thinking when you asked the question about two books that I just left in my office, and I was thinking I should have brought here. One is Robert Service's phenomenal book, which is The End of Cold War. Robert got this is a famous British scholar who got, I don't know if he got Pulitzer, but his work is phenomenally recognized. It's called The End of Cold War, and the other one is Edward Lucas about the new Cold War. And those two are just two major historical political publications about the fact that the stand is that the Cold War has not ended. In terms of if I were to answer that, the only way I would answer it is it didn't end because, I'm going to say rhetoric because that's my specialty, because the discrepancy of the discourse between the leaders of the West and the leaders of let's just say the leaders of the autocratic countries, including Xi. Xi had just had, I don't know, he's just working for his presidency for life right now. The discourse, the political leadership words that come of these leaders to their people have not changed in the sense of that. So if you measure from the 60s to 2022, the fact that, including Yushchenko, I mean, I'm thinking of the major dictators and autocrats of the world, that kind of discourse of nationalism, of heavy-duty nationalism, which you see now even in France. I mean, you see this in Europe now, you see in far right in the States, you see it. But in those countries, it is the root of their major way of thinking of their sovereignty, their country, etc. And now if you go to talk about democracy and the discourse of democracy, ours had changed way more than those countries' rhetoric. So if I just look to analyze it, I would say Putin makes a lot of mixture of history. I mean, he's basically moving Russia, whatever was Soviet is Russian now. He doesn't call the Second World War, he calls it the Great War, which is the Soviet War. And yes, in the East, it was called the Great War. In the West, Churchill time, it was called the Second World War, right? So just looking at those two acclamations, declamations, and proclamations of what are the discourses of these two, they are obviously haven't met, it's what Robert said, they haven't met yet. They have not been able to justify collectively some consensus. That's my view.
Thank you. Robert, would you like to go next?
Sure. Palina, it's okay with you?
Sure.
Yeah. Listen, from my perspective, I see, the Cold War ended. And I'll tell you why. Because Putin and Xi, as a matter of fact, they didn't like the post-Cold War era. As a matter of fact, they have been extremely unhappy with what's going on. And part of Putin and how he is and how he projects himself, there are probably Noemi knows. He did two important speeches. In 2014, he did a speech before the Duma, and in 2015, he did a speech before the National Assembly. And you look at them. How does he look at the war? He said, "Listen, the Crimean people, they were treated like sack of potatoes." This is what he says. He thinks that Russia was not robbed; it was plundered and robbed. And third, he believes that you have a historical injustice that afflicted and inflicted Russia throughout the after the Cold War. So from his perspective, really, he went along with the post-Cold War era. But now the post-Cold War era ended. And the problem is that we entered into a post-Cold War era with uncharted waters. What are the uncharted waters? Not only you have China and Russia, you have India, you have Pakistan. Have you heard Pakistan? You have Egypt, you have Saudi Arabia, you have Indonesia, you have Mexico, you have South Africa. So maybe when we say, listen, it's between democracy and autocracy, I would say, yes, it is about democracy and autocracy, but it goes beyond democracy and autocracy. From my perspective, who looks at the geopolitical position of United States, I think it's going now revolve pretty soon around the US global position in the world. This is what I think myself.
Okay, thank you. Palina?
Yeah, I would like to kind of, I guess, reflect more on what Naomi just said, is that I would not call it the Cold War continuation as well, just because, at least on paper, the Soviet Union assumed some sort of plurality, right?
Yes.
The Yugoslavia assumed the Union of Nations. The Soviet Union assumed a Union of Nations. There is a monument that is on the border where actually Belarus, Ukraine, and Russia meets, and it's called Three Sisters, right? So the whole rhetorics was, well, there was politics behind, but rhetorics was there is nations and we're friends, and it was good for Soviet Union to have more votes in the United Nations and so on. And what we have right now is absolutely the opposite. It's, again, it's substitution of all the achievement of Soviet Union by equalizing it with being Russian, and the whole horrible, again, I'm following both English language and Russian language media, so it's scary about all this denazification, what Putin claims, and now it's how it's expressed in the media, how in detail described. If you use the Russian version of Google, the more scary is that you see these claims and new, let's say, notions that he, even right now, Putin feeds his own people, but it's the whole information space that is upside down, and it makes you feel like it was always there, you just never Googled it before. So we're not talking about main news channels, we're talking about all sort of maps, all sort of publications dated was 5, 10, 15 years ago. You think it was always for Russian Google that Ukraine never existed. And it's very scary.
I want to say something related to this discussion about war. I'm going to get to the war, but one of the things that I studied and I wrote for almost 30 years and I'm going to write continuously about it, is about the rhetoric of communism, and which is based fundamentally on a distinction between the rhetoric of communism is based on no debate, no argument, no public argument. It is based fundamentally on praise and blame, which is epideictic since the Greeks. I mean, thank God for Aristotle. But when you have praise and blame and you don't have an opponent to work on praise and blame, and one of the things that had been solidified in this war is the solidification. You have a rigidity of the enemy. Doesn't matter which one. And it is based on accumulation. I mean, if I learn how to hate, and I've been the director of peace studies. When Dalai Lama was here at FAU and talked about compassion, I could see people don't understand what compassion in a Buddhist way is, which is not desolidification of the enemy. Or when Thich Nhat Hanh talks about a Vietnamese monk who forgave the American Vietnam War, talks about de-ossification of the enemy. So this is exactly the opposite of some things that had been praise and blame. So what you see, and the media, in a way I agree with Robert, the media doesn't help. It doesn't matter which one we do, the information is fundamental to understanding. But also, the understanding of what is happening is also fundamental to understanding. So, when you have, Putin had been excelling in creating the West as the enemy for 20-something years. He hasn't stopped change the enemy's colors. The enemy are now a solidified West, is NATO is with, I mean, I'm not talking about the American policy, that's Robert's deal, and he's right, but I'm just talking about the fact that when you have it's like a religion, when you have such a passionate enemy building in your life, in your house, of course you don't have room for discussion, you don't have room for arguments, you don't have room for consensus, you have room for continuous learning how to hate, not learning how to. The Ukrainians were lucky in that sense because the changes had been much, I mean, the Maidan and everything else, the people had been lucky to be able to deossify deossify the enemy. as the West, for example. That doesn't mean that in Ukraine there are not people who are not hating the West. It just means that they had deossified it based on their changes in the 90s, but so did the Baltic states and stuff, right? But when you have this, and you see this in social media with Chinese now, the Chinese people are telling you why to hate the West because they had dehumanized us and they made us, they humiliated us. And that's something that is important when you have a rhetoric of praise and blame.
Okay.
I want to compliment Naomi, but from a historical perspective, which is extremely important.
Okay.
Mainly about the collective consciousness of a culture. You know, not only Putin. Many when they speak about Putin, he's one man. They say, no, he is the spearhead of a whole KGB, people, period. It's not one, it's not two, it's the whole, the way they think. Listen, from their perspective, it's important to note that, Russia, as a matter of fact, when Napoleon went, 600,000, went in, he reached Moscow, and what did the Russians do? They burned Moscow and they did not concede to Napoleon. You know what did he say? He said, what kind of Scythian people they are? Scythian, they are, these bad people at the time. I said, what kind? Then, listen to this. Then came the Nazi invasion. The Nazi invasion, 3.2 million people, they went in. Now, why I mention this, for example, Putin and his like-minded people, they say, listen, Russia has played a key geopolitical, role in the world. They shaped our world, Now listen to this, and let me put it in perspective for you. After the Napoleon invasion came Waterloo, and Waterloo ended Napoleon domination of European politics. Now, after the Nazi invasion, what came? The landing of the Normandy. And they paid 24 million people. So from their perspective, as a matter of fact, they say, listen, what happened to us is a humiliation, and this is where I compliment her. This is a humiliation for us, and for someone like Putin with a KGB mentality, they're not going to accept that. So he went along. He said, listen, we can no longer accept that. And what I worry about it, as a matter of fact, today, is that we have miscommunication with China and United States, or with China and the West, and the same thing is gonna repeat itself, vis-a-vis Taiwan. So really, and this is why it has been building up. And the number one priority for me today, for someone who lived in war, I lived in war. And not only that, also the Iraq war. I was very close to the Iraq war, The number one priority now, and the war. Every day it goes, it's the worse. Every day it war, more unintended consequences. So this is the priority. Yes, we should help the Ukrainians. Don't get me wrong, really. We should help them, but at the same time, you need to have parallel channels, parallel to speak with Russia, and even I will include China too. I don't see this happening myself. I see what's going on in the world, really.
So I think I have a good follow-up question to that, and then I want to move on to talk about a few other things. When we're thinking about just ending the war, as you said, Robert, I know that the Ukrainian president has said that in order for them to agree to the terms of a peace agreement, it would require Russian troops withdrawing, and that they would require a referendum from the Ukrainian people. Given that that's very unlikely, what do you think, all of you, what do you think will happen in terms of seeking some sort of peace agreement?
Right. So I'm glad you mentioned this referendum, and we just had referendum, and Belarus asking Belarusian people what we think about political neutrality on the 27th of February, and Belarusian people said no. So there is no referendum in not free countries. It's called plebiscite.
Yes.
It's called plebiscite, so let's call things their names. So there's no point of doing any plebiscite in any occupied territory with a gun to their heads. Mussolini has been doing that. So what is the purpose of any plebiscite? Is to humiliate these people even more, to bring them more scared, to put them lower and feel them more worse, and so on and so on. So
To repress them.
To repress them further. There's the only point of any sort of referendums. And we know there's a referendum in Crimea, we have referendums here and there. Why he doesn't take a referendum in his own Tatarstan? Huh? Why doesn't Putin ask his own people? Right? Yeah. So, but I would like to kind of also reflect on what Robert said, because he mentioned very important world wars with Napoleon and with Nazis and the wars going on right now. And I would like to emphasize that these guys were aiming Moscow, but the troops in the war and people are dying in Belarus and Ukraine and all of the wars you mentioned. So those people in Russia, where the Russian population lives a little bit close to Moscow and Babylon, they didn't have Nazis, they didn't have Napoleon, and that's the same thing. So it's always we're talking about Russia and the politics and interests, but it's Ukrainian people who died, Belarusian people who died, and we need to stop the war, absolutely.
So how do we stop the war?
Naomi, you have something to say?
No.
Okay,
How do we stop the war?
No, well, I have something, really, let's go back to history and put, cross the T's and dot the I's. Really, first things, Crimea. Let's go back to history. Crimea was not with Ukraine. Crimea was with the Ottoman Empire. Wow.
Exactly.
And really, you had the Tsarist Russia that formed in the 1700s. By 1774, they won Crimea. They signed a treaty called Kushuk-Kainarjak. They ceded it and became Tsarist, important place where it became, now they have an influence in the Black Sea, but also they projected their power in the Caucasus. The Caucasus never won. It was always a rested region. So really when we say, Crimea, Ukraine, Crimea was given to Ukraine by Khrushchev when Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union. So let's put this one first. Second now, this is where, as a matter of fact, I start. Crimea, if you go to Putin now, tell him, okay, let's compromise over Crimea. Probably he will compromise over the other regions. He has to compromise because also it is not in his benefit to continue the war. To continue the war, he's gonna break Russia. And already he knows he did a strategic blunder. So he's not gonna win the war. So mainly his maximalist demand, Putin, is no longer there. And the Ukrainian too. They have to also, say, listen, okay, there is an option, Ukraine could be part of the EU, which I strongly, strongly recommend. As a matter of fact, the faster they become part of the EU, the better for them. And second, say, listen, for the time being, moratorium on NATO. And let's discuss, regarding the Donbas region.
And you think that
Well, let me
we're
mention
agree to
this.
that?
Well, listen, you cannot, we don't know until we sit down at that table and discuss all those. Now, and another thing also, we have a similar situation. Northern Iraq, the Kurds. The Kurds, as a matter of fact, in northern Iraq, they have a state in all but in name. So the Donbas could be in Ukraine, but again, it could have a similar situation, similar state like the Iraqi Kurdistan. So myself, I see when you have that political will, when you have two negotiating teams, and two negotiating means mainly the West has to negotiate and has to go and has people with them. Turkey is a good one. China, I would like to see China more, really involved. And then you have Putin. Putin, at the end of the day, I feel that, listen, he is losing. He is losing people, he's losing money. China, Russia has become a pariah. And you have, let's not forget, from a historical perspective also, Russia was always with the West. It's all history, catch up with the West. Nobility intermarrying with the West. And now you have this whole shift. Let me tell you, don't you know that? Don't you think that Putin now is worried about it, Russia becoming a Chinese vassal? Really? I'll tell you why. Because, he needs the lifeline. And his lifeline is going to come from where? It's going to come from where, really? From Egypt. Okay, Egypt will not sanction, Indonesia will not sanction, but the money is going to come sooner or later, and everything's going to come from China. So mainly in their partnership, they have a strategic cooperation. He's going to be not only a junior partner, he's going to be less than a junior partner. So really, it behooves him to go sit down at the negotiating table, but you have to offer him something. Now, regarding what they say, well, he's a criminal. Yes, he's a criminal. And then I will tell you, listen, look at Milosevic. He did the Dayton Accord. So do a Dayton Accord, okay? And then look after that. So one step come after the other. And me, what I worried about...
Milosevic ended up arrested and before the tribunal. So
but listen, but Dayton Accord, it was signed and everything. The war ended.
True.
The war ended. And then you had, what I mean?
So one quick question, if you could briefly tell me this, because you guys say that it's very easy to see that Putin's strategy has been clear, his rhetoric hasn't changed. So what is his goal? If you think we can get him to agree to some sort of peace agreement, then you must have some idea what his goal is.
Yes.
What is that?
Crimea and the Donbas region with
That's
him,
it.
and Ukraine not part of NATO, and Ukraine not to be stationed for especially United States deployments.
But you
This-
think he'll allow EU membership?
Yes, he will. This is the way I see it now. Of course, I cannot speak in absolute terms, but this is the way I see it.
But don't you think that, given what you've said about China and the concerns that are obviously real, that we're just driving Russia into the arms of China and encouraging a partnership, that's more damning for us in the long term. So don't you think that a strategic and opportunistic Putin would see that as an opportunity rather than just a cost?
As a matter of fact, listen, already they have a partnership, strategic
Well, of
partnership.
course.
Already they have it.
But to deepen it,
You know, and it's gonna get deepened, but now you look at it, who's gonna benefit more from this relationship? Who? The Chinese, of course the Chinese. So if you benefit more, that means you are not only part in that relationship, that means you are now less than a junior partner in that relationship.
I want to say something else that change a little bit, because there are no solutions that are clear to any of
Or
this.
perfect.
Or perfect, yes. And yes, I think Putin will probably stop, like Robert said, he's not gonna lose the war, but he's not gonna win, but he's not gonna lose, meaning he needs something out of it. My point about this all is that I don't know if we have just woken up on it, but the level of violence and the level of redistributing history in the sense of national identity, sovereignty, in the name of Nazification, denazification. It's phenomenally interesting to call denazification something where the Jews are not there. I mean, and or the people who were, the Bolsheviks are still in Russia. So what are we denazifying?
And the president is a
Exactly.
Russian Jew, right? So
Yeah, so what, all these words, the thing that is phenomenally difficult to handle for all of us, both at the level of scholarship, but also as citizens of the world I lived in a dictatorship, he lived in a war and a dictatorship, we all did, yeah. So that's not the experience, the personal experience really haunt us too. I had nightmares for 10 years about defecting, leaving my country of origin. But the thing that is fundamentally different, and it needs to end, is this humongous amount of violence that is making all of us unable to participate more, to be able to find a solution when the violence is so humongously in front of you. I mean, there is just such a large area of violence in talk, violence in history, violence in justification, violence in public, but more and more important, violence in killing people. And that is something that I think, in some ways, I'm sorry to say, he didn't lose the war because he was willing to kill people in the name of his own ideas.
well, of course, I think
And that is something that for the war it's an imperative thing. We need to end it. That's all it is.
Well, I think over time we've seen that something that's consistent throughout Soviet and Russian history is that human beings are disposable.
Yes.
And they're willing to sacrifice as many as possible, unfortunately. And when we talk about violence and we think about political violence, I think it's important for us to recognize Russians are suffering from large-scale repression given this conflict. There are some Russians who have spoken out and they have been sent to Siberia or disappeared or otherwise. We've heard about the regional violence that everyone's experiencing. If you think about refugee violence, you have Ukrainians trying to leave. You also have the violence at the border with Poland, where you had other sorts of folks from other places that had sought refuge and were being thrown back and forth between the two countries and now can't leave Ukraine and are being forced to fight for Ukraine. So we have political violence at virtually every possible level occurring right now in the region.
Absolutely.
Correct.
Paulina, you wanted to say?
yeah, I guess I 100% agree with Robert on what Putin wants, what he would agree. But I think, at least for me, being in Rada, in this government in exile, we've been observing it for a while, and that was the main conclusion anyway, that the the whole war is kind of a masquerade to actually make a final statement on Donbass, Lugansk areas and Crimea, to make finally the world approve it, because the war been there since 14 and there's no resolution, back and forth, people killed, there was no statement of the entire world about these regions. It was clear that whatever the rhetorics, Putin would never be able to control the Ukrainian population. It's just not possible. These people are used to elect their presidents, even they're not happy with their presidents, they're gonna go and impeach the president and so on. So there's no way, no carrots, there's no carrots that exist that Ukrainians would eat, right? So it was clear from the beginning that he would never be able to control the region, no matter how many military guys he would, unless he really just exterminates everybody, which was also, he's not at this capacity anyway. But to bring these questions that bothered him for a long time on the international agenda, finally said, now you guys talk to me, and as you said, let's agree to the least loss, which at this moment of the tragedy is going on, is the least loss. He just wants to finalize the project that he started earlier.
Listen, Angie, something that really terrifies me myself, when I hear about Putin and if he's gonna be pressured and he's gonna be pressured, and you see the violence that we spoke about. My biggest worry is that really, if you paint him in a corner, he's gonna use nuclear tactical weapons. Somehow
really
I
think he
feel.
would?
Oh yes. The way I studied him, the way I followed his career, yes, he would. And this is what I worry the most, because listen, in the Russian system, there is nothing to prevent the use of unconventional weapons in conventional warfare.
Like
Nothing. As a matter of fact, if Russia is threatened, they can use it. It's right there in their doctrine, and that was written in 2009. So this is what I worry again, and this is why I really think that the West should work. Let's help the Ukrainian. Let's give them more weapons. Let them fight, but also at the same time, a parallel channel, extremely important. And let's have more people, with us. And I don't mind having the Chinese with us. Really, although I worry about China, you have no idea how much I worry about China. But now, really, we have to stop it. Because really the world, if you want to look at the United Nations Security Council. Do you think it's working now? What's working? Look, they want to sanctions, and they want to kick out Russia from the human rights. Yes, they will say, you have, how many? 90 countries said voted yes, but look how many countries said no. So how many countries abstained? As a matter of fact, the number of people who abstained or who said no, way more than the people of the 90 countries. So really you have extreme radical changes are taking places. We are in uncharted waters, and I really think that we have to count to 10, we have to be sober, and we have to think strategically.
Okay.
This is what I think.
You pretty much answered my final question, because we do have to wrap things up. And so my final question was going to be to say that the UK just committed $130 million in military aid, and President Zelensky has obviously made a very public plea to Joe Biden for support, and he has said they need weapons, they need military supplies. What, if you all were Joe Biden, what course of action would you take?
I don't want to be Joe. I really don't.
Well, in this thought experiment, you have to be in charge.
Look, I think I would have thought about it a little bit more before February, in a sense, and what would happen if the invasion happens. But I think, to be absolutely fair to Joe Biden, I think that out of all the leaders that I see in the European Union and the United States, he is put in the most difficult situation to be the sort of the leading leader, so to speak, to commit the most. And I'm not saying, I really like what Robert had to say about United States and how the blunders we've done and in some ways Biden has to pick up all the pieces. And I don't think that it's fair that he's a little bit, in my view, left alone rhetorically at least, from the European Union, from the United Nations. So Joe Biden, to me, had already committed much more than I know any other president of any other country had. I'm not talking about prime ministers, I'm just talking presidents now, and had clearly stated the United States position, probably with much more generosity of means than any of the others. So,
Well, in
I
fairness,
certainly-
as the hegemon and the biggest military industrial complex in the world, it's sort of a responsibility. we
it
have,
is,
right?
but he's doing it compared to any other.
To some extent,
To
is
some
it
extent.
enough?
Well, I don't know that. I wish I knew.
Palina, you have something to say?
I guess I'll let you this time first.
No, go ahead.
She wants to
I
have the
reflect,
final word.
yeah.
Oh, you have to reflect. Okay, let me tell you this.
Reflect, yeah.
We already giving them Stinger and javelins.
Yes.
You know, we already doing this. We are giving something. Listen, I don't know how many tanks the Russians have, but we gave them thousands of Stinger missiles. We gave them thousands of javelins. So many, and I know that, you know, that a lot of weapons are going in. A lot of weapons are going in. But there is a limit where, you know, and this is what I worry again about the media. Well, when they say, listen, it's not about when we are going to go, it's not about if we are going to go to war with Russia, it's about when. And here you hear it in the media. You hear it in the media. Go to CNN, some pundits there, go to MSNBC, and I would say some folks. This is, I absolutely disagree with. I think that it will be a huge blunder, a huge strategic mistake if we are going to go in a fight with Russia, period. So yes, we are going to support the Ukrainian. We should give them more Stinger missiles, more Javelin. They need more, M16, more, launcher. Listen, we fought the Soviet Union. We supported Mujahideen that we brought from all over the world, and these were not, as a matter of fact, organized, and they kicked the Soviet Union from Afghanistan.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? So this something happened before. Now you have an army and something about it. People don't like to speak about it. We have been supporting the Ukrainian army since 2014. Let's not forget that.
Sure.
And we have been preparing 100,000 troops to be right there. So the point is, let's support them, but let's not be involved.
Okay.
Okay? Thank you.
Palina?
I guess I go to where we started as well, to the soft power of words in education, since we are also here in the educational facilities. So if I would be Joe Biden, I would actually stream some funds besides the military into, I'm not saying propaganda, but education. Because a lot of people in this country have never even heard what Budapest Memorandum is. And they don't understand the whole thing. They just, all of a sudden Ukraine happened. Right? They say, well, we've been in other wars here and there, but so why we need to protect Ukraine now? Why we need to get involved? I heard this from my students who are young. They don't remember these old stories, right?
Right.
They don't even know that Ukraine had military weapons. They don't even know that Belarus had nuclear weapons. And all that happened, and when the Clinton was there removing them, and how they actually successfully sold all this nuclear back to Russians in their hands, right? So why don't we know all this? Why don't we know? But regular people don't know that. And let them make a decision since we're in a democracy and tell their president what should be the course of action. But do this advice to the president being informed.
Okay. Any final thoughts before we adjourn?
I think we are lucky to be able to be in an institution where actually the Center for Peace Study, Peace, Justice and Human Rights actually is willing to talk about it. We're also lucky of the fact that we, each of us, teach. So I teach about Eastern European rhetoric. I teach about autocrats and dictatorships. I'm happy to say that it's an environment where I think it's a privilege in a way to be able to discuss it openly, to discuss it with students, to discuss it with colleagues, to discuss it as an issue of education, as Palina said, not just an issue of the harsh reality. And we are able to actually respond to students' questions. I've been doing this, and
Yes.
I'm sure everybody did. And I think that's a benefit to where we are in terms of our institution. And I've been the director of peace studies. I know the work is tough. I don't think peace will ever be a non-violent issue about a non-issue about human rights. It will continue to be a problem in the world, but it is something that we contribute to. So I'm honored. Thank you for inviting us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.